We're going to start our next panel discussion now. We're going to get some perspectives on the green recovery and the opportunities to build back better and greener. Let me introduce our moderator for this discussion, Simon Retallack, Director of the Carbon Trust. Over to you, Simon.
Thanks very much, Sasha. A very warm welcome to all of you who are joining us from around the world for our day of events and panels. It's my pleasure to open our next panel in the summit, Perspectives on Business and the Green Recovery. A green economic recovery has become a powerful rallying point for a lot of countries and cities in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. Momentum's clearly been growing for a response to the economic crisis that we're in, that focuses on delivering investment that not only reboots the economy, but also transforms it to address the other great crisis of our time, climate change. Now, we've known for a while that investment in things like energy efficiency, renewables, sustainable mobility, and nature-based solutions are also good for the economy. They generate jobs, they boost productivity. Not only that, they can generate more jobs than investment in fossil fuels. Modeling, for example, published by Nick Stern and other economists recently shows that for every dollar invested in energy efficiency and renewables infrastructure, you generate double the number of full-time jobs than if it was invested in fossil fuels. In the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, governments have so far pledged to invest over $10 trillion to economic stimulus measures globally. One of the big questions, though, clearly is how much of that will put us on the path to a green and ideally a net zero recovery and not a business as usual high emissions recovery susceptible to continued climate risks. Amid all the horrors of the pandemic, the losses and the suffering, there is an unparalleled opportunity, it seems to me, to build a better world, to reshape business and the economy to ensure it's climate proof for the future, bigger probably in scale, even than the great post-war Marshall Plan. But this isn't all down to governments, and in this panel, we want to explore what opportunities there are for companies to work with governments to build back better, looking at examples of success and areas where longer-term business model adaptation may be necessary. To debate these issues, I'm delighted to be joined by three distinguished panelists. The UK's, or I should probably say Her Majesty's Ambassador to Sweden, Her Excellency Judith Gough, Shirley Rodrigues, who's London's Deputy Mayor for Environment and Energy, and Raimondo Orsini, who's Director of Italy's Sustainable Development Foundation. A very warm welcome to all three of you, and thank you very much for joining us today. Now, before we kick off our panel discussion, I wanted to point out to all of you joining us that you can submit questions for the panel online, so please send them in. But first, some questions to the panel from me. Panelists, I'd like to bring all of you in on this one, just to get us going. A lot of people might imagine that the levers to make a green recovery happen are all in government hands. What do you say to that argument from business? What role can and should business play in building back better in the cities or the countries that you work in? Judith, could I start with you on that one?
Yes, thank you. And thank you very much for having me on this panel today. And I'll preface what I say by saying that in my role as ambassador to Sweden, I am not an expert in climate change, but it is a fundamental core of what we do here in Sweden as the British Embassy and an area where we partner very strongly with our Swedish hosts. I think for me, in terms of what role can and should business play, I think business is already playing a role, and certainly I see in what I am doing now huge investment by business, Swedish and increasingly British business as well, in green recovery, in technologies tackling climate change, in innovative solutions, climate change finance, for example, another crucial area. In terms of really where the sort of balance of influence lies, I mean, clearly it's in all our interest to partnership between government and business, partnership between countries. This is a global problem, But I think for me, one of the things that I see increasingly in my conversations with the experts that we host here and with government here is that actually there is an increasing role for the consumer or the voter. A lot of this is being driven by the people. And I think that is something that business and governments are responding to. Clearly, we have a duty to lead as well. And I think one of the great things about being the British ambassador at the moment is that the UK internationally is genuinely leading on this agenda, but also very keen to partner with all key stakeholders, and that includes business very much at the forefront.
Fantastic. Shirley, what's your view on this question of the role of business in a green recovery from your perspective in London?
Hi, and thank you also for inviting me to tell you a little bit about what we're doing in London, I think, as some of the examples. But I'd echo a lot of what Judith was saying. You know, this is a leadership issue. The Mayor, Sadiq Khan, has only got around, only has powers or levers over about 50% of the emissions in London, say, on climate change. And in many of the aspects of green recovery one. We don't have all the powers that he would like, all the funding indeed. But what we do have is a role as leaders, as conveners. Judith mentioned, you know, we should be listening to our voters. We should be listening to our customers, you know, if you're a business. And these are areas that we can all take a part, play a part. It is a collective ambition. We've set up a London Recovery Board that the Mayor is co-chairing with the London local authorities, there are 33 of them. And on that board are a host of stakeholders from around London, from the business sector, from the community, from universities, Transport for London and so on, because we recognise that individually we cannot deliver on a green recovery or tackle some of the challenges that London is facing. You know, the climate emergency, the ecological emergency, our air pollution crisis in London, let alone all the social aspects that COVID has highlighted, particularly around you know, the inequalities that we face in a whole host of issues, but, you know, including the environment. So I think there's a lot we can do, and there are a lot of good networks and good campaigns and good organisations out there that if you're not already part of, you should be part of, you know, especially in the run up to COP26 next year, and using that as a way of focusing on how we recover in a fair and resilient way is absolutely critical.
Fantastic. Thanks, Shirley. Raimondo, I'd like to bring you in on this one. Obviously, a lot of businesses are taking action on climate change. What's different about the green recovery piece of that? What do you think businesses should be doing on that?
First of all, I'm very glad to be here. You know, Italy and UK are working together next COP, so we are doing the work. Basically, what is really has changed is the role of the businesses from the past. Businesses until 10 years ago, they were resisting to targets and commitments and rules. And so we're part, let's say, of the resistance instead of being part of the revolution. It has completely changed. Now they are part of the green revolution. They can contribute a lot with the leading role. What we see in Italy from our perspective, basically they can contribute with in three different ways. First, they can give the example by reducing all their emissions, including their products and services, giving a lot of boost to the targets and to net zero. Second, they can give governments, national, cities and regions, technical solutions. Governments need, and cities and regions need technical solutions for green recovery, so they can cooperate with governments and working together to provide technical and green solutions. Third, they can do an action of responsibility in their territory. We've seen many companies and businesses doing something out of their business core business, but helping the communities with direct investment in greens. I see these three areas, and we see growing and growing. So the green economy basically is led by businesses now more than by governments, and this is something very important, I think.
That's really interesting, Raimondo. You talked about some of the companies that are driving this sort of agenda. Are you Are you able to give us some examples in Italy of some of the leading companies that you can say are very much part of a push to ensure a green recovery?
Yes, I can give you some example. Of course, the most evident is in the energy sector. We have companies completely divesting from fossil fuels and already only investing on renewables. Big companies like Enel, many of them, and this is really something that can be a locomotive. Companies, that are starting with fossil and in a few years only renewables. Then we have a steel example. The steel industries are looking very fast towards a complete reshaping of the technology. So giving out the coal and starting to use gas and hydrogen, and this is the Ilva, for example, in Italy, and this is something very important because we are talking about huge investments in a few years. And then let me tell you about something that cities would love. It's the sharing mobility. In our foundation, we have the national platform on sharing mobility, offering solutions. In Italy, the public transport is not as good as in London or Paris, but sharing mobility companies are investing in bike sharing, scooter sharing, different ways of sharing, and this is helping a lot by reducing the emissions in the cities. These are 3 examples of something that's happening in these years and growing a lot in Italy.
Thanks very much, Raimondo. Shirley, from your perspective in London, have you come across any good examples of companies perhaps that you're working with in the mayor's office that are really leading in this space?
We have lots of examples. You've definitely got to have a look at our website. We run a London Business Climate Leaders. For example, there are about 10 major corporations headquartered in London where we've been working with them to say, what more can you do beyond the commitments you've made to your own company to contribute to reducing London's footprint, whether it's on climate change or environment. These are organisations like Derwent, Landsec, Tesco's, and so on. So some really big ones. And key to that is, they're looking to do things around cleaning up, buying renewable energy, making sure their energy buildings are energy efficient, looking at their operations, electric vehicle charging points, but most of all setting science-based targets if they haven't done that already. But I should also point out that London, actually most of the businesses in London are SMEs. So we have a lot to do in terms of trying to support our small business sector, and we're doing a lot of work in terms of accelerators and so on. And there's some great examples of individual businesses which are developing the new business models that Raimondo talked about. So an organisation called Heater that is looking to capture waste heat from some of the data centres, computer data centres, or PowerVault that's looking at energy storage. We have lots of circular economy businesses being set up. And then, on air quality, we've been, as you know, we've instituted an ultra-low emission zone in London, which has seen a dramatic drop in the numbers of vehicles coming in London, huge drops in emissions. We had a sort of end-of-term report published, which you may have seen written up in Reuters and The Guardian a couple of weekends ago. And these are, the reason we're able to do that is because we've got good companies like the Royal Mail, UPS, many others who are moving into zero-emission vehicles, electric vehicles, and partnering with, for example, the electric vehicle company to set up, new lines of vehicles, which helps in terms of a green recovery, in terms of jobs, not in London, unfortunately, but up in the Midlands, which is where the factories are, the electric companies are. So I think there's lots of good examples out there, and I think it's just really inspiring to see businesses really taking hold of this and running with it. As Raimondo said, it's great to see that it's not sort of resistance but revolution now.
Fantastic. We'll come back to some of the things that you're doing in London to encourage that sort of action in a second. But before we do that, Judith, from your perspective in Sweden, what are you seeing? Are you seeing any good examples of corporates really coming forward on the green recovery front?
But I think, in my diplomatic career, if you wound back a few years when talking to businesses, this didn't feature largely as a conversation. And now when I go and see the CEOs of the Swedish companies, it's on every single agenda. And it's part of the DNA now, I think, of the conversation and the approach, certainly in Sweden. And I think that's something we really, really welcome. You know, for example, if you take IKEA, you know, their plans are to use only renewable and recycled materials in their products by the year 2030, and they're looking at powering all their buildings using 100% renewable energy. And that's a familiar story that you hear here again and again. If you look at Swedish companies that have a particular footprint in the UK, if I take the Prime Minister's recent commitment to deploy 40 gigawatts of wind energy in the UK by 2030, there's a Swedish company at the heart of that called Vattenfall, and Vattenfall is a leading Swedish energy company which is working towards fossil-free living within one generation, and they have been heavily investing in offshore wind facilities and test and demonstration facilities in Scotland. So this comes back to my point of earlier, that actually what we're looking at are businesses that cross borders in the same way that the climate challenge crosses borders. And we have some very good examples of where companies in Sweden are really leading the charge. If I take Climate View, for example, which is a tech company which supports cities and nations to basically develop their own climate roadmaps, drawing on a lot of points that Raimondo was making earlier. So I think, you know, having gone from a few years ago where, you know, we really weren't seeing, as diplomats, much energy invested in this sector, it is really now part of the everyday conversation, which can only be a positive, and part of our bilateral relationship too.
That's fantastic and encouraging to hear, and reflects what we're also seeing across the markets and the geographies that we at the Carbon Trust work with. Clearly, when we talk to companies around the world, many of them say we need governments to do more. We need governments to provide the right incentives, regulation, financial support, etc. When it comes to the green recovery, what are you all seeing where you are? We heard a little bit from you earlier, Shirley, about the sorts of measures you were putting in place in London. What else would you like to do to support businesses to achieve or help with the achievement of a green recovery? What's your latest thinking at the moment in London?
Well, through the Recovery Board that the Mayor is co-chairing, we've set up 9 missions working with the London boroughs and businesses and so on. One of which is a Green New Deal. There are a number, one of which is High Streets for All. So I'll pick those two just because they're very relevant to the sort of the impacts of the pandemic and how we recover from them. So obviously, those of you who know London know that we've had a dramatic fall in the numbers of people working in central London, partly because we're now being told again to work from home if we can, which has meant that more people are working in sort of outer London or back in their neighbourhood. So how do we make those places better? So part of that activity that the Mayor is doing is he's putting some finance into this through supporting some funding for a Green New Deal, and we'll be working with others to develop projects to help support either local authorities or businesses to make those areas better, and through the green recovery. We've also set up advice services, the London Business Hub. We have a number of existing programs that we are now reorienting to support businesses in terms of a green recovery. So the accelerators I mentioned earlier, there's Advanced London and Better Futures, which help SMEs. The Business Hub I mentioned is advice generally. We have financing through the Mayor's Energy Efficiency Fund, which is a £500 million worth of loan funding which is available to SMEs and others to help invest in new products or new services in London that are related to climate change. So there are a number of support mechanisms, but I think the biggest thing, obviously, that we've been lobbying government very much for is through the comprehensive spending review and through matters like the devolution bill and the sort of various other environment bills that are going through, to provide some certainty on the long-term policy trajectory and make sure there is long-term funding for some of the issues that we need, like retrofitting our buildings in London, which would make a huge dent in in our carbon emissions, really help reduce them, but it would also help things like fuel poverty in our homes, but also help the bottom line for businesses. And for those of you who don't know, we have a couple of technical assistance programs that might be useful. If you don't know, again, have a look on our website. There's a retrofit accelerator for homes and one for workplaces, again, which can then help develop the pipeline for that funding that we have through the Mayor's Energy Efficiency Fund, but we're also seeking additional funding from government for.
Thanks, Shirley. A lot of important initiatives. Clearly, in Sweden, Judith, clearly Sweden has long been seen as one of the global leaders on sustainability. What sort of measures has the government put in place there to encourage a green recovery in the midst of the pandemic?
I mean, you're absolutely right, and we see Sweden as one of our key partners, particularly as we move towards hosting COP26, which, as we all know, has been postponed for a year. And we've just had the UK's climate change envoy, John Merton, here in Sweden last week to precisely discuss how we partner with Sweden going forwards and how we encourage, as two leading nations in this area, greater ambition globally. But if you look at Sweden, they have just released what they call their greenest budget, which, for example, gives £45 billion in green credit guarantees and is directing money towards reducing emissions. I mean, the measures here, I think, are extensive and expansive, and I think a lot of innovation really being driven by both government and their policy making and what they are providing to business, but also by a real investment in high-tech solutions and looking at the art of the possible when it comes to innovation. Some of the solutions are simple, some of them require government leadership and good policy making, but actually some of them are really reliant on really good, innovative business leadership, and I think that's something that we see quite clearly in Sweden, not just in the technologies coming to the fore to tackle climate change, but also, for example, in financing options as well, which is a growth area where we, partnering with Sweden and also countries like Finland, are looking to develop our work together.
Fantastic. Thanks, Judith. Raimondo, from your perspective in Rome, what's the government doing? Is it enough to promote a green recovery?
Well, it's never enough with the government. We always complain. But what is very interesting is that we are in the middle of this Green Deal and Green Recovery Fund from Europe. So it seems like helicopter money where we can do everything. And Italy is very important because it's getting around 210 billions of euro from the Next Generation EU. So now the big debate in Italy is how can we really use this money for the green recovery? How can we be sure that they can go to start a new a Green Deal initiative instead of doing the same things that we've done before the pandemic era, let's say. So it's very important now, and this is the main point of the debate in Italy, that we use some criteria. For example, the EU taxonomy. I was listening to the previous panel about the green finance, something that can really help us in telling the right green projects from the brown economy ones. Otherwise, everything can be done by simply putting a green word, adding the green word to this. So what is really important, and this is the main core of the debate, is that the government can focus with the green criteria for investment. And listening to Shirley, in Italy, the government did something very interesting 2 months ago for the energy efficiency in buildings. We had a national law dedicating 110% return of the investment for the green buildings and the energy efficiency also for private citizens and businesses. 110% mean that you can get 10% from these investments in 5 years and covering all costs. This hopefully will give a boost for a deeper innovation of our building. This is something very good that the Italian government did. So let's wait. I think that in 5 months, we can give you a clearer idea of the results of the investments.
That's fantastic. Raimondo, thank you very much. There's all sorts there that I think we can all learn from. My last question I wanted to pose to you was about the sorts of trends that are emerging as a result of the pandemic, which will affect businesses over the long term, which they should be adapting to. What are you seeing in that sort of sense? I'm thinking, from my perspective, of the sorts of things such as the need for shorter, more resilient supply chains, the adoption of more circular business models to maintain, retain the value of resources and products better. Or even, of course, businesses aren't just businesses, they're also employees, they're also consumers. Greater demand from employees and consumers for greater work-life balance now that people work from home more, and more nature-based solutions. Are you picking up in the conversations that you're having any of those sorts of trends? And if so, how should businesses be reacting? What sort of adaptations should they be taking or making? I'll start with you, Judith, on that one.
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, I mean, Sweden, I think, has long had the work-life balance well and truly nailed. So I'm not convinced that the pandemic has assisted that in any sense. I think the Swedes have done a good job on that. You know, of course, the pandemic has made things different. Sweden has not at any point been under lockdown as other countries have. There have been restrictions here, and people have followed the guidelines and the recommendations of the government. So we're seeing a much lower footfall in city centres, for example, particularly in Stockholm. That clearly has an impact on how people consume. And it clearly has an impact on transport and infrastructure. I think you're right on supply chains. I think the watchword on supply chains is resilience. And I think Sweden, like a number of countries, found that an awful lot of roads led to one or two countries. Was that good for resilience of supply chain? Possibly not. So I think what we're seeing potentially is a move towards some more regional supply chains, but not exclusively regional supply chains. I think it's about resilience and balancing risk. And of course, not all components can be sourced in a diverse manner. I think, you know, the increasing shift towards digitalization. I mean, Sweden is a digitalized economy, much more so than anywhere else. But clearly, you can see that trend continuing as people engage by digital means and make use of the technology. I think that means that what we will see is, as well as losers during, well, not losers, but people who suffer disadvantage during this pandemic, there will be companies who do very well out of it because they are innovating, because they spot opportunities. And I think it's worth pointing out that we will see both opportunity as well as huge downside risk and disadvantage during this period. And I think also, perhaps a slightly broader point, we're also starting to see greater interest in investment screening. And I think, again, that is part of the global resilience piece, and countries, including Sweden, looking very closely, or much more closely than they have done previously, at investments coming in and how sustainable they are, and the nature of those investments as well.
Thank you very much. Fascinating, and digitalization should definitely be on my list. Interesting to hear about investment screening too. Shirley, what are you seeing in terms of these sorts of trends? How long term do you think they'll be? What sort of impact will they have, and how should corporates be reacting?
Again, many of the things that Judith has mentioned, and a number of the missions that we've set up in London are reflecting that. So we have a digital mission, which is looking to address the need to ramp up the connectivity in London, but also tackle the inequalities that people have recognised. You know, many people in London don't have access to the internet, let alone high-speed internet, let alone the hardware or whatever to be able to use that. And that's individuals as well as businesses. So how do we make sure, as part of our recovery effort? So that is a big issue. I think we've done various pollings. Lots of people have done various pollings that show that that people don't want to go back to what was business as usual. You know, they want something different, and they're very clear that they want the good things that have come out of this pandemic, the experience of the work-life balance, being closer to the community, being closer to nature, being closer to families. They want to preserve that, and they want it to be green, and they want it to be resilient, and they want it to be fair. So I think for businesses, it's recognizing that has shifted. And we've seen that in our own polling. The World Economic Forum has done something similar. So our business models and the way that we as local authorities, as the mayor, are responding to people and how we develop our city, we've seen what we don't want. So what do we want? It's a cleaner, greener city that is accessible to all. So how do we build together to that? So I think that's a big area. The other one I would say is Scope 3 emissions. So we've been looking at a lot around our direct emissions, and we've still got a lot to do. But people are questioning, where they're not necessarily buying so much, and that's possibly going to be, worse as we look to recovery, and knowing that there are going to be people who are not going to recover well from the situation we're in. People are talking about K-shaped recovery, where some people are thriving, but there are a lot of people we know as furlough ends that are going to be in a very dire situation. So in terms of Scope 3 emissions, where is our supply chain coming from? Yes, absolutely making it resilient, but it's also got to be sustainable and really ethical as well. So these are questions that your customers are asking. People are asking us about what are we doing as government to support businesses working in London, for example, on divestment. We've been doing a lot of work on divestment, and working with our own pension fund authority and seeing that pretty much down to 100% divested. We launched something with New York and have got 10 other cities, including cities in Italy, Milan and others, Oslo and others around the world, looking to really look to that sort of greener agenda. So I think that's a couple of big sort of trends. I suggest that if people aren't paying attention to, and I'm sure you are, that it would be good to have a look at that.
Thanks very much, Shirley. And last but not least on this one, Raimondo, what's your view?
Well, I think the list you gave, it's all happening now. These trends are happening. I fully agree with Shirley and Judith about a radical change that's happening in the mind of people. The pandemic deeply touched all of us in a different way, but it gave a sometimes unconscious link between our life and sustainability, both environmental and social. So each one of us as customers, but also as business people, has been touched and is thinking about how to change the future. We can see it. I can see it everywhere. So since we are going very fastly towards lunchtime, let me tell you about food. Also because we are in Italy. I made some questions about, the organic food supermarkets and retailers in Rome. Usually they are from 20 to 40% more expensive than the normal supermarkets. And then when you ask them what's happening now during this lockdown period, or the past lockdown period, and what happened, and they say we have increased our sales, our income by 20-30%. People want to eat better in a much more quality, environmentally checked way. So even if they are working less, maybe have troubles thinking about the future and their gain, how much they will gain and which will be their salary, they spend more for healthier food. What does it mean? That's the trends are really moving towards maybe selecting good quality. And the other point is about social. Sometimes we forget that environmental should be coupled with social. And for example, remote working and smart working that in Italy has increased a lot, and 100% during the lockdown. It's leading to something that we didn't expect. It's leading to people thinking which will be my next job? How can I improve my job? I'm sure that I'm doing the right job, because they have more time to think about the future. So sustainability is acting, and we are learning the lessons from this pandemic. Now it's the time to make them real, and the businesses, the one that will win are the one who can understand before the others how can make them real.
Absolutely. Raimondo, thank you so much for that. Lots of good thoughts and ideas. I think we've got a few minutes for some questions from the audience. Sasha, have you picked up any?
Hi, Simon. What a great conversation we're having. I think Raimondo is a bit hungry for lunch, but let's start with the most popular upvoted question, which is to all of you and to you as well, Simon. Can you give some advice to those who are working on sustainability and emission reduction in companies, but want to have a bigger impact on the workplace and community so that they join in?
Interesting. I might go back to you on that one, Raimondo. What's your
did I get it right? The advice on the one working and how they can impact more. This is the point. How they can have a bigger impact.
I can read it again. Can you give some advice to those who are working on sustainability and emission reduction in companies, but want to have a bigger impact on the workplace and community so that they join in?
Well, first of all, I think it's very important to get the commitments from the top management. What we see is that there are a lot of good ideas from staff and people and managers, but you get the higher impact and the highest impact whether you convince the top management. So it's very important that we have a direct involvement of the top management in all the actions, involving them and telling them and showing them which are the benefits for themselves as a persons and people and for the companies if they do something for in the workplace directly that can be visible and can be shared with all the employees. Otherwise, it can raise some conflicts and it can take time. But involving directly the top management in the workplace would be the most effective way, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree. I might just provide a few thoughts. Totally, of course, management have to be brought in, key decision makers. If there are targets, filter them down. Good communication, making everyone aware of what they can do, whether it's in the community or within the business, making behavior change easier is going to be critical. Shirley, Judith, do either of you want to come in on that one before we get another question?
I'd say work with your local authorities. There are a number of programs. We're all looking at recovery now. And I think for businesses, especially for the bigger ones, don't cut your CSR programs. They are so important. I know we're all facing tough times, but they are a really good way of getting into the community. And they are absolutely critical for those NGOs who are working with the community, the small ones and the bigger ones, who are reliant on those programs as well and can deliver the sorts of behaviour change that is needed and is wanted. So I think those are a couple of things I would just mention.
I think for me, I'd agree with all that's been said. I think it's also about starting a conversation in the workplace that everybody takes part in. Climate change affects us all, and therefore we are all part of the solution. And I think some of the more valuable conversations that I have had in my embassy and with my team have been those discussions that involve everybody and encourage everybody to take part and put forward their own
Sasha,
ideas.
Are there any other questions?
I'd love to squeeze in one more. I mean, this isn't a simple question, but what are we not doing at present which you're frustrated about to make a change, and how can this be developed now with some urgency?
Okay, Shirley, I might throw that one to you, and you can talk about the UK more broadly, if you like, not just London.
Okay, well, there's probably a long list in our lobbying asks of government. I think the biggest thing would be, Raimondo's talking about the European Commission and the Green New Deal funding. We are still waiting for some policy certainty and the funding certainty to really take action. There's a whole host of things we could be doing around some really good energy efficiency programs, looking at our taxation system to incentivize, for example, electrification or mode shift, energy efficiency in buildings. And we have such a huge opportunity in the run-up to COP26 to send those signals. I think a really big one would be the government announcing the phase out of fossil fuel vehicles, new ones by 2030, just as a start. That would be fantastic. So I could go on, but I don't want to take up a lot of your time.
Have we got a quick reaction from you, Judith, on that? Anything you'd like to?
Yes, I'd turn it out a little. I mean, my sense is that you know, both the British government and the Swedish government are leading the charge on this. What you have in the UK and Italy partnering with us as well are countries that get it and really are being innovative in their policy making and setting quite aggressive targets. I think where we need to do more work is on bringing other countries with us and ensuring that we come out of COP26 with a more global commitment to ambitious targets to reduce emissions and to tackle climate change. And that's going to be quite a heavy lift, but I think, again, partnering with each other, working together as the UK and Italy are doing, and the UK and my host Sweden are doing, has to be part of the way forwards to get the global action that we need and not just in our own countries.
Thank you so much. We're out of time, but Raimondo, a final word from you before we wrap up.
Final word, fully agree with Judith. Let's look at next COP26. I'm very frustrated about following. I started following since COP6, and in all COPs, they say the next COP will be the good one, not now, but next time. I'm very frustrated about this. The only COP, the Paris Agreement was a success. All the others will say next one. So let's focus on COP26 to make practical decisions and unilateral commitments from the nations and from companies. This would be the better success for all of us, I think, the best success.
Excellent. I totally agree with you, Raimondo. It's been a real pleasure speaking to you today. Thank you, all three of you, for sparing the time and for giving us such an interesting conversation and some stimulating debate. I am now going to close. Thanks to all of you for joining us for this session. And I hope you all keep well and keep safe. Over to you, Sasha.
Thank you so much. So much more we could have talked about there, Simon. So many more questions to answer. But unfortunately, we've run out of time. And I'm delighted to welcome our next speaker, Baroness Brown of Cambridge, Deputy Chair of the Committee on Climate Change and Chair of the Carbon Trust.
Hello, and thank you. And can you hear me?
Yeah, I think we can hear you, yes. Can you hear us?
I can hear you, that's fine. Thank you very much. Well, I'm delighted to be here, despite the fact, as Raimondo has reminded you, I speak between you and lunch, so a challenging slot. I want to now show you some slides to take you through my presentation. So can I have the first slide, please? That's the second slide. Can I have the first slide, please? Okay. You've lost my first slide then. I want to talk to you about the UK's net zero ambition and its role in securing a green recovery. And by a green recovery, I mean both a low carbon and a resilient recovery. So if I could have the next slide, please. So we've been making good progress in reducing our emissions in the UK, and this slide gets shown a lot by the government. And it's normally shown as a way of saying, look, we've managed to reduce emissions, and we've managed to reduce emissions much faster than the G7, whilst also increasing our GDP. And it's almost it's slightly apologetic. You know, we thought that reducing emissions would be really bad for GDP, but look what we've managed to do. And I'd like us to move the thinking into being not that we've managed to reduce emissions while increasing GDP, but that we've increased GDP because we've reduced our emissions. And there's some really interesting new economic modelling in the press today, which says that Australia could unlock an investment boom of $63 billion over the next 5 years if it aligns its climate policies to net zero. So, you know, that's about we can increase GDP because we're reducing our emissions. Could I have the next slide, please? So every year on the Committee on Climate Change, we look at how the UK is doing in terms of reducing its emissions. And this is our latest assessment that was published earlier this year. And it shows that we're doing quite well in some sectors. We're doing particularly well in terms of reducing emissions from power. We're doing reasonably well with industry, and we're doing quite well in waste. But we have two really difficult sectors, transport and buildings, where progress is either flattening off, or in the case of transport, emissions are now above 1990 levels. So where we have good, strong government policy, as we have had in power, with strong signals like the removal of coal from the system, with strong support that we've seen, for example, for offshore wind, government policy can really encourage both investment and technology development, and can deliver the sort of impressive change we've seen in power. But the challenge is we now need to see that kind of change across every sector of the economy. And we really do need to see that change coming fast, because if I could have the next slide, please. We've just upped the ante. Last year, we moved our challenge in line with the IPCC modelling. We've moved our challenge from being an 80% reduction in emissions to 100% reduction in emissions, or achieving net zero emissions by 2050. And as you can see from the slope of those two schematic lines, which show, very rough schematic pathways from where we are today to 2050, the slope of the green line is quite significantly steeper than the slope of the red line. And at the same time as we're doing that, if I could have the next, the scale of the challenge we have, thank you. The next slide, thank you. The scale of the challenge we have to achieve net zero in the next 30 years is a very significant one. We've got to at least double the size of our electricity system. We've probably got to increase by a factor of 10 the installed base of offshore wind. We've got to create a hydrogen industry up to a scale of something like today's electricity system in terms of its the energy it needs to provide. We've got to develop a carbon capture and storage industry. We've got to increase our planting of trees by something between a factor of 3 and a factor of 5. We've got 30 million buildings which need insulation and low carbon heat. We've got to completely transform our car fleet to zero emission vehicles. We've got to, in order to make room for all of this afforestation and woodland planting, we're going to need to change the way we use our land use, and hence the way we do our agriculture. And in order to do that, we're going to have to change our diets and considerably reduce our consumption of meat and dairy. So that's an awful lot of change to deliver in the next 30 years. And if I could have the next slide. And it's not just delivering net zero, but actually we've also got to adapt to the changes the climate is still going to be bringing, and we've got to make sure that we are resilient to those changes. So we're going to see temperatures continue to increase, even if we're on a net zero path, such that by 2050, the summer of 2018 will be a typical summer. There will be a 50% chance that every summer is like 2018 by 2050. The number of people living in areas of significant risk of flooding could almost double, even on a 2-degree path. We will start to see significant water deficits unless we significantly reduce our water consumption. Heat mortality will increase. The quality of agricultural land, because of periods of hard rainfall, because of periods of drought, because of flooding, because of intensive farming on top of that, the quality of our agricultural land is likely to drop quite significantly. So at the same time as we're reducing our emissions to net zero and building all of that new infrastructure, we've also got to be adapting to the changes the climate is bringing, and as I say, building the resilience of our people and our economy. Could I have the next slide, please? So the Committee on Climate Change wrote to the Prime Minister in May this year to say we need to take building back better from the COVID-19 crisis as an opportunity to really get a move on with all of these challenges. That we really need to make this not just a an economic recovery, but an entirely green and resilient economic recovery. So using climate investments to support the economic recovery and increase jobs. The government itself should be leading a shift towards positive long-term behaviours, so setting an example from the nation, capturing the benefits of working from home, of more walking and cycling, some of the changes we've seen during the COVID-19 crisis, making sure that we look at this issue of the resilience deficit and make some investments to start providing greater resilience. So accelerate the £5 billion that the Environment Agency has had committed for flood defences. Accelerate that investment, start that work early, do more of it. Make sure that what we do embeds fairness. For example, we need to recognise that young people today are those who are going to have to deal with the worst impacts of climate change. They're also the people who are having to deal with some of the worst impacts of COVID-19, with their future job prospects, in many cases, looking rather dismal at the moment. But there are also, of course, other elements of fairness. We've got to make sure as we recover and as we do, as we make these green investments, that the people who pay most are not the people who can least afford to pay. We need to make absolutely sure that the recovery isn't locking in high emissions technologies or increasing climate risk. And when we're looking at tax changes, think about how we can be introducing carbon taxes, how we can strengthen incentives to do the right thing through tax. So, for example, while oil prices are cheap, is this not the time to think about increasing the fuel price escalator? Because we've seen a very negative trend of people taking advantage of low fuel prices in recent years and also more efficient vehicles to move to buying much, much larger vehicles with a huge increase in the sales of SUVs. So could we have the next slide, please? A green recovery really does touch on many of our priorities for recovering from COVID-19. And one of those, of course, is going to be creating new jobs. And Simon mentioned some of these things to you in his introduction earlier, that we're expecting to see huge amounts of global investment in sustainable energy over the next 3 years. So there's a real positive for economic jobs. I don't know whether you can, sorry, my computer is having a little fit. It probably needs some lunch. We're expecting renewable energy spending to surpass that of oil and gas in 2021. We talk a lot about tipping points in climate change. I hope this is an economic tipping point where investors really start to see that actually fossil fuel investments are the past and renewable energy investments are the future. And I hope we're going to see a real acceleration having reached that tipping point in terms of investment. Simon mentioned that almost 3 times as many jobs are created per pound spent from renewables and energy efficiency investments versus fossil fuel investment. That's a really important message for our investors and our politicians as we think about building back better. We can address by really rolling out energy efficiency and insulation measures into homes. We can really start to address fuel poverty issues. And we also, all of these jobs that we can create in a green recovery will be UK-wide jobs. If they're jobs in terms of insulating people's homes, then of course they're right across the country. But many of the jobs in renewable energy are clustered around the coast in depressed coastal regions and things. So we see fantastic clusters like that around the Hull and the Humber, where we've seen the development of the offshore wind industry has reduced unemployment claims in Hull by 50%. So a real demonstration of the job creation potential of renewable energy industries. And of course, really important issues that contribute to health, like increased green space, absorbs CO2 emissions. It also provides porous surfaces where the increased risk of surface water flooding that comes with climate change can be addressed in our cities. Gives us an opportunity for increased exercise and indeed more walking and cycling to reduce driving also will do that. And of course, the things we need to do for net zero, reducing meat and dairy, will actually give us diets that are much closer to the government's recommended healthy eating guidelines. So all of these things about a green recovery are entirely aligned with doing the right things as we recover from COVID-19. Could I have the next slide, please? And so these are the resilient recovery policies that the CCC has told the government it would like to see, and it would like to see urgently. So a big rollout of housing retrofits, small business energy efficiency, and district heating schemes. Really helping local areas build their own energy plans, green building passports, looking at the longer term things, the expansion of the electricity network, the carbon capture and storage, development of the hydrogen industry, making sure we're rolling out EV charging so that people can see it is safe to buy an electric vehicle. Not looking so much at road investment, but thinking about improving our broadband, because I'm sure we've all experienced the gremlins of all of this virtual working. Pulling forward that investment in our flood defences and driving forward with recycling and the circular economy. Supporting people through reskilling and retraining, through all of the initiatives in nature recovery, enabling remote working and encouraging further cycling and walking. And we've seen some very good things in London and in other cities with all of these new cycle lanes appearing on our roads. So much more of that to come, I hope. Using fiscal incentives like introducing carbon taxes, only giving bailouts to companies where they have agreed on their green targets and their pathways to net zero, increasing our science and innovation spending, and really driving home the need for climate change risk assessments. And of course, using the UK's opportunity as the UN lead on inclusive and sustainable recovery, and of course, the COP26, to really take a global lead to make sure we drive a green and resilient recovery. Could I have the next slide, please? And I think post-COVID, in order to get this building back better, we're going to need to see a new and stronger relationship between business, government, and finance. All of the things that these sectors do will need to be closely interconnected. Many businesses are seeing strained finances and challenging business conditions, and yet they're under pressure to deliver their net zero commitments. We've heard about how they need to be thinking about making their supply chains more resilient. We've heard also, Shirley was talking about consumers, but also investors wanting to know more about what businesses are doing to reach their net zero goals. We've got governments with this greater need to intervene to support business and support jobs and the economy. The urgent need to develop its climate change policy. It's the government that's unfortunately distracted with COVID-19 and Brexit concerns as well. And it's actually probably a government that doesn't have the experience that it might like in translating its political commitments into really rapid delivery, which is what we need for this recovery. And we've got a finance industry that wants to be investing in things that are going to make a return, wants to understand what is the risk of investing in some of these new technologies versus the traditional technologies. Of course, that has the huge benefit of a nationwide network that can enable it to engage and support businesses, both large and small. So if we can really get business, government and finance working together, then we really can speed this building back better. And of course, the Carbon Trust has all sorts of ways of supporting business, government and finance in terms of bringing them together, but also in supporting them all with their challenges in the current situation. So if I could have the next slide, please. So as an example, government needs to get a lot of business support up and running quickly. And the Carbon Trust has some great examples of existing programs which could provide a fantastic template from that. One of these is the Carbon Trust-led Consortium, which runs the Welsh Government Energy Service. And in the last couple of years alone, this has supported 190 green energy projects right across Wales. So this is the kind of template that could very rapidly be scaled up in order to deliver the kind of projects we need for a green recovery right around the country. Could I have the next slide, please? In terms of businesses, lots of businesses have, and it's been great to see, lots of businesses have been setting science-based targets, have been committing to them, have been signing up for the race to zero, and we want to encourage more and more of that to happen. Now, that's a tough enough process in itself. I've been through the Science-Based Targets website, and it's really quite complicated to follow. But actually, once you've done that, that's just the first step. And the next step, of course, is you've got to deliver them. And that really is the difficult bit. And that's, again, where Carbon Trust has been providing a lot of support to a number of companies, some household names, some not such household names. But here's a great example from the Carlsberg Group with this, I think, very brilliant cartoon that shows actually where all of the emissions in their supply chain are. And the extraordinary piece of information here that if you want to go for one really big area as a starting point, then packaging for them is a very big issue. So again, the kind of support that business needs, both to communicate with consumers about what it's doing, but also actually to make sure it is genuinely taking the steps that will deliver the targets it's signed up to. And if I could have the next slide, please. And then, of course, for people providing finance services, for people making investments, there is all of this new technology to be considered, to be assessed, to be looked at the risk of. So Carbon Trust has extensive experience right across the entire project life cycle, from developing the strategy through the high-risk phases of construction through to the lower-risk phases of operation, and of course the critically important issues of end of life. So support for investors in thinking about how do you put together those portfolios of green and resilient investments, and indeed how do you make sure that the claims being made about those investments are actually accurate. So this is, I think, a very exciting time. I think, as the International Energy have said, COVID-19 is offering us an opportunity to reset and to really get going on this green and resilient recovery. And I hope I've given you some examples of where Carbon Trust can be hugely supportive of industry, of investors, and of government in doing that. If I could have the final slide and say, thank you very much.
An interesting presentation and so many thoughts to leave us to think about before we head into lunch. Speaking of which, it's time for a lunch break if you're in the UK or Europe, probably time for breakfast if you're joining us from Mexico. We'll be back in 50 minutes at 2 o'clock BST. And please do join us and keep those questions coming in. And if you have a moment, please have a look at those 2 polls that are going to be on your platform, and we'll be discussing the results of those later. Thank you so much.